Welcome to the program Global Weekly News, serial number 154. First item, elections for judges in Mexico. On 1st June, 1.3 crore voters, that is 13% of the electorate, went to the polls to celebrate a historic election day. For the first time in Mexico, judges were democratically elected. The ruling Morena party passed its long-awaited judicial reform on 11 September 2024, thus changing the constitution. One of the central aspects of the reform promoted by former President Andrés Manuel López Obrador is that from now on, judges of all types will be elected by popular vote. Candidates could not receive public or private funds to carry out electoral campaigns. In total, 2,681 judges were elected, including 9 high judges of the Supreme Court of Justice, 386 district judges, etc. The lower voter turnout was expected. It was a midterm election. Voter turnout was on par with the elections of judges in countries such as US, Japan, or Bolivia. According to several polls, the president's approval rating is over 80%. President Claudia Sheinbaum stated that in next judges' elections in 2027, voting percentage will improve. Judges close to Morena party will win most of the seats. Sheinbaum argued that the old judicial model had very serious flaws and even facilitated corruption. She also pointed out nepotism within the system in the past. Second item, comrades, Israel kills hundreds of aid seekers in Gaza. At least 220 Palestinians were killed or injured on 1st June after Israeli occupation forces opened fire on crowds of starving people at aid distribution center operated by the US-based Gaza Humanitarian Foundation in Gaza's southern city of Rafah. Injured Palestinians who miraculously survived the massacre and were transported to Nasser Hospital in the southern city of Khan Yunis told doctors that they were surrounded by gunfire from all sides, which were launched from drones, boats, tanks, and Israeli soldiers on the ground. Commissioner General of the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East, UNRWA, Felipe Lazzarini, commented on the massacre in a post on X, describing the aid distribution center as a death trap and the distribution mechanism in place a humiliating system. This system has forced thousands of hungry and desperate people to walk for miles together to the distribution center. On 27th May, the first lethal attack took place in Rafah aid distribution center, in which Israel shot dead a number of Palestinians. Hungry Palestinians were cordoned off inside metal cages surrounded by barbed wire, reminiscent of Nazi ghettos and concentration camps for Jews in Eastern Europe. Senior US officials involved in Gaza ceasefire negotiations, both in the Biden administration and the current Trump administration, have been under fire due to their prioritization of the interests of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Palestinians held US envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, responsible for massacre on 1st June after he swiftly rejected Hamas' response to his latest ceasefire proposal on 31st May. Witkoff's rejection gave Israel the green signal to escalate its military operations in Gaza. Hamas offered to release 10 living Israeli captives and the 18 dead bodies of the captives. In exchange, a number of Palestinian prisoners would be agreed upon for release, provided that US President Trump guarantees Israel's commitment to a 60-day ceasefire and the flow of humanitarian aid to the besieged strip. It is worth noting that 58 Israeli captives are currently held in Gaza, 34 of whom are dead. Hamas said that keeping as many Israeli individuals as possible in its captivity is the strongest negotiating chip towards guaranteeing that the ceasefire deal will not be breached again, especially after Netanyahu's government violated the truce with unwavering US support last March. Witkoff's proposal stipulated the release of half of the living captives and half of the dead to call a 60-day ceasefire deal. Hamas did not agree to this, therefore talks broke down. Comrades and friends, the third item, Freedom Flotilla Coalition to Gaza, carrying 12 volunteers and essential supplies. The Freedom Flotilla's coalition Madeleine ship is sailing to Gaza despite the risk of Israeli attacks. On 1st June, the ship Madeleine departed from the port of Catania carrying essential supplies including baby formula, diapers and medical prosthetics, that is body parts and artificial body parts, fully aware of the very real risk of violence by Israeli occupation forces. The Maldives crew includes climate justice activist Greta Thunberg and member of European Parliament Rima Hassan, along with volunteers from Brazil, Germany, Netherlands, Spain, Sweden and Turkey. Rima Hassan said on the day of departure, "I am aboard Madeleine because silence is not neutrality, it is complicity. The Palestinian people in Gaza are being starving and slaughtered, and the world watches. This ship is not just carrying aid, it is carrying a demand. End the blockade, end the genocide." The 12 volunteers are calling on the public to take action against the genocide and urging government to ensure the ship's safe passage. They have limited expectations from governments, especially in Europe, which have repeatedly demonstrated unwillingness to break with the complicity in Israel's crimes. Complicity means going in support of Israel's crimes. Instead, the crew has appealed to the media for extensive and accurate coverage, which they hope could offer some protection from interference. The Israeli army says it is ready for a wide range of scenarios which would be implemented in accordance with the political instructions. The Madeleine's crew warned on social media on June 3. Political instructions refer to those sanctioned by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, for whom the International Criminal Court has issued an arrest warrant on suspicion of war crimes. A group of UN experts recently warned that any attempt by Israeli forces to block the Madeleine ship would violate long recognized international law practices. The International Court of Justice shall ensure unimpeded access for humanitarian aid. Previous Freedom Flotilla's missions have been met with repression, and concerns have been raised that the Madeleine may be targeted, as was the Conscience, another flotilla vessel hit by drones in early May. Fourth item, comrades, 10th anniversary of Women's Movement, Argentina. The Ni Una Menos, or Not One Woman Less movement was founded in Argentina on June 3, 2015. It was born out of mass mobilizations to demand an end to all forms of gender-based violence in the country. The mobilization on June 3, 2015 was called for in the wake of the brutal femicide of 14-year-old Chiara Payas by her 16-year-old boyfriend Manuel Mansilla in May 2015. When news of her brutal murder broke, social movements, feminist activists, journalists, activists, and academics launched a call for mass mobilizations in cities across Argentina to demand justice for Chiara and an end to femicides, sexual assault, and other forms of violence against women. On June 3, 2015, hundreds of thousands of people flooded the streets in 80 cities in Argentina. In the capital Buenos Aires, over 3 lakh took to the streets, making it the largest march rejecting violence against women in the history of Argentina. Thanks to strong pressure and mass mobilizations, Chiara's murderer, Manuel Mansilla, was sentenced in September 2017 to 21 years in prison. In the past decade, the Ni Una Menos movement has expanded and became a collective campaign for women and gender diverse people and their social struggles. It has also spread across several Latin American countries such as Bolivia, Chile, El Salvador, Guatemala, Paraguay, Peru, and Uruguay. Movements in Argentina and Latin America and the Caribbean continue to fight to eradicate all forms of gender-based violence and for justice for the victims. This year, feminists will join pensioners, people with disabilities, immigrants, healthcare workers, and social activists in a mass mobilization to protest Javier Milei's attacks on the people of Argentina. Fifth item, comrades, South Africa's proposed trade deal with the United States. South African delegation led by its president Cyril Ramaphosa met US President Trump on May 21st to reset the strained diplomatic relations and secure a trade deal exempting its exports from tariffs. South Africa's proposal to buy liquefied natural gas from the US for 10 years in exchange for a quota of duty-free exports for a small section of highly subsidized foreign-owned multinational corporations shows the ineptitude or lack of skill of the President of South Africa. Sipho Gadima, former chairperson of the state-owned Petroleum, Oil and Gas Corporation of South Africa, said that the proposal is neither technically feasible nor financially viable. As per the proposed deal, South Africa will be allowed to annually export 40,000 vehicles, 38.5 crore kg of steel, 13.2 crore kg of aluminium to the US without facing tariffs. These exports face zero tariffs under the African Growth and Opportunity Act passed by the US Congress. Effective since 2001, it has been renewed several times, providing US consumers tariff-free access to goods and raw materials produced by cheap African labor. However, the act was practically nullified by the tariffs Trump imposed this April. The 31% country-specific tariff imposed on South Africa based on the trade deficit the US has with it was reduced to the standard 10% during the 90-day pause announced days later. However, the 25% blanket tariff Trump imposed on all automobiles and a list of auto parts remains in place. This is a particular problem for South Africa. 64% of whose exports to the US under the US Act last year were automobiles, with 68% of its manufacturing outbound. South Africa's auto industry is heavily export oriented, with the US as its third largest and fastest growing market. Securing a tariff exemption for this sector is a high priority for South Africa. Sixth item, comrades, Europe's left must unite to oppose NATO. Instead of militarization, Europe should be seeking to regain access to cheap energy from Russia and expanding trade with China as part of a policy of economic recovery. As Europe approaches NATO's 24 to 26 June summit in The Hague, its 75 crore people face a decisive strategic choice that will affect their lives for years to come, and one with far wider global impact. Europe is experiencing worsening social conditions. Its largest war since 1945 in Ukraine and the biggest rise of far-right authoritarian, racist, xenophobic forces since the Nazis in the 1930s. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has proposed to the 32 NATO members that at the NATO summit aim for 3.5% hard military spending by 2032, a 75% increase from the previous 2% of GDP target. Trump calls for even higher military expenditure of 5% of GDP. Rutte opened the door to this by supporting a commitment to 1.5% related spending such as infrastructure, cyber security and things like that, also achievable by 2032. The 3.5% plus 1.5% adds up to Trump's 5%. Europe's economies are nearly stagnant, with the European Union's annual per capita GDP of growth averaging less than 1% from 2007 to 2024. Far-right and neo-fascist forces exploiting the worsening conditions which are caused by austerity measures and increased military spending by blaming immigrants, ethnic and religious minorities will gain further strength. Left-wing parties that have opposed austerity and NATO policies in France, in Germany and in Belgium have maintained or significantly increased their support. This disastrous collapse suffered by traditional left-wing parties that have supported war and austerity is extremely dangerous in the context of the rise of the right parties across Europe. The only way out of this situation for both Europe's population and the left is a complete policy reversal to one that prioritizes social progress and economic development. Seventh item's comment. World Health Assembly. During its annual discussions on the World Health Organization's monitoring and engagement in health support for Palestine, the 78th World Health Assembly once again confronted the devastating impact of Israel's attacks on the Gaza Strip. Global South countries such as South Africa, Iran, Cuba, Colombia, Malaysia, Maldives and others issued statements in solidarity with Palestine and called for decisive international action to halt the genocide. The draft decision seeking accountability for attacks on healthcare and demanding free deliveries of humanitarian support, among other things, was supported by 104 countries, 4 voted against and 19 abstained. Over 50 member states were absent during the vote. $130 crore worth health infrastructure was damaged in Gaza. 20 lakhs Palestinians are in need of mental health support. Palestine urged the international community to match moral clarity with concrete action, halt arms export to Israel, and urgently review all economic and trade relations. 8th items, comrades. Spread of cholera in Sudan. The fighting between the Sudanese Armed Forces, SAF, and the Paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, RSF, has been going on for the past 3 years. Children in Sudan are already weak due to lack of nutritious food. A rapidly spreading cholera is ravaging war-torn Sudan's capital, Khartoum, and its twin city, Omdurman, which have been left with no supply of water or electricity, and few hospitals, most of which have ceased to operate. Set to worsen with the onset of the monsoon, the UN Children's Fund UNICEF has warned that over 10 lakh children are at risk of being infected by the deadly cholera. On May 30, the Health Ministry announced that it received over 29 lakh cholera vaccines from the International Coordinating Group on Vaccine Provision. Ninth items, comrades, Colombia. On May 28 and 29, Colombians took part in a massive national strike in defense of the progressive government of Gustavo Petro and the popular consultation on the labor reform proposed by his government, which would give workers more rights and guarantees. The reform has been met with opposition from right-wing parties, hegemonic media, and big business. The reform mandates shorter working hours of 42 hours in week than previous 48 hours. Lastly, comrades, Argentina. On May 28, thousands of scientists, academics, and students protested in Argentina against the critical situation facing the National Council for Scientific and Technical Research. The protests followed the announcement by the neoliberal government of Javier Milei to cut the state budget for scientific research from 0.3% of GDP to 0.15% of GDP. That is half of the previous allocation. Javier Milei is receiving support from international financial organizations, particularly the US. Milei is having domestic political support. He continues to attack the attacks of people. Thank you, comrades. Lal Salam. See you next week.